Greetings all, Ferrariman601 here. In addition to Ferrari, today McLaren have also released their 2017 Formula One challenger, the MCL 32. The MCL 32, amid a whole flurry of controversy toward the end of 2016, is the first McLaren since 1980 not to bear the MP4 nomenclature in the name of the chassis. MP4, of course, deriving from the merger between McLaren and Ron Dennis's Project 4 Formula 2 racing team in 1981, thus bringing about the MP4 moniker for all McLaren Formula One cars produced between 1981 and 2016. Therefore, this makes the MCL 32 the first McLaren not to bear the MP4 moniker since 1980, the last McLaren to be produced under the old M nomenclature was the M30 in 1980, which was a prototype, and I believe it only raced once before being superseded entirely by the MP41 in 1981. However, McLaren, for the first time since 1981, are now through and through 100% McLaren, and we can all think what we will as to the controversy that surrounded the departure of Ron Dennis from the team. Of course, McLaren can owe all of their recent championship success to the leadership of Ron Dennis, and I have to say that the entire affair was very ugly indeed. However, onward and upward, McLaren, here we are in 2017, and here is the MCL 32. I do ask all of you to bear with me. I am dealing with a little bit of a technical constraint here using MS Paint for the telestration, simply because, as we zoom into 100%, you will see that most of these shots will be cut off simply because the resolution is too high for my screen to render entirely in one frame. We want high-res shots, we want to be able to look at the technical details on this car, and there certainly are a lot of very interesting ones that we'll be talking about, but unfortunately it means that some parts of the car will be cut off as we zoom in more closely. You can blame Microsoft for that because there's no way to define a custom zoom in MS Paint, at least what you get out of the box from Microsoft. So apologies for that, however, we will bear with it. The first technical detail that is immediately evident on the orange and black MCL 32 is the nose. As we can see here on the front where the Honda logo is, McLaren have gone for a thumbnail nose, just like all of the other teams except for Mercedes. Force India running a variation on this, but it's the same overall design. McLaren running a thumbnail nose. Mercedes is the odd man out thus far. Everybody else is running this thumbnail configuration. Again, a lot of us were under the impression that these noses would go away this year. They most certainly have not, and I have the suspicion that Red Bull and probably Haas as well will run a thumbnail nose. So Mercedes looking to be the odd man out with that. However, the rationale behind the thumbnail nose is exactly the same as we have been seeing on all of the other cars thus far. We are channeling that air that's coming across the front wing into the center section of the front end of the car so that we can start to blow areas in the center section of the front end, as we can see. Front wing details on the McLaren. First of all, we can see the delta profile quite nicely here on this shot as we turn inboard from the outboard sections, and you can see that delta profile, of course, homologated in the regulations. Moreover, however, on the front wing, we can see this very complex design once again on a launch spec wing. First of all, we can see the cascade elements here on the outboard sections of the wing. Very, very nice. Very intricate geometries going on there. Already a tremendous amount of development work has gone into this. However, we can also see a very sophisticated flap section on the main aero elements of the wing here. I am counting 5 flaps on this McLaren wing, so they are running just like Mercedes with a very complicated front end aero treatment already. Even more complicated, however, and this is the first time we're seeing this on a 2017 car, at least in launch spec, we are seeing these gills cut into the sides of the mounting pylons for the front wing. And we can see them encircled there, these 3 gills, these pseudo-NACA ducts cut into the pylons. This is interesting, and it makes me think about the front barge board, the pre-barge board sections that we are seeing on other cars, namely the Mercedes and the Ferrari, as to what they are trying to do with the aero treatment across the very front section of the car. It looks like air is going to be allowed to enter into these slots here, and what happens to it next is anybody's guess, but we can see another barge board element coming down in a similar fashion to what we have seen from the Mercedes so far, as well as the Ferrari, circled there in black. Looks to have a similar function as to similar appendages on the Ferrari and the Mercedes, but it seems like the overall rationale is just to start to funnel the air around that section of the car. We'll get our line tool here so we can do that properly. Funnel that air in this direction and then toward the barge boards behind the front tire, of course, before it starts to curve out and go around towards the edge of the floor and then into the center section of the diffuser. So again, we can see that same aero philosophy going on here on the McLaren. Another obvious detail that we can point out, we clearly have another double wishbone pushrod suspension layout, as we can see very clearly on this side of the car. Up and down the grid, this is proving to be ubiquitous, just as we all were predicting a few days ago when we first saw the Sauber. No tricky work going on here on the front suspension, everybody playing it safe with the double wishbone pushrod arrangement that we've seen really since the very end of the 1980s in Formula One. It seems to be the best way to build a front suspension on a Formula One car. More details that we can see here on the front end, very interesting ones. We haven't seen these yet on any other cars. You can see here on the car we have sort of a vestige of a canard wing, if we can call it that. And yes, it would be a canard wing. However, we see that it is connected to the upper element of the barge board. And this is a very unique feature. We've not yet seen this on any other 2017 car, McLaren of course being the first therefore to debut this feature. This means that the barge board and the canard wing are obviously functioning as one cohesive unit, and the implications for this are simply that they have that much more control over the airflow as it passes around the front suspension and into the barge board area, and then therefore they are able to direct it into the radiator ducts, as we can see there, as well potentially to help that air spill around the front surface of the barge board to interact with the turning vane up top in this section here, and then of course to funnel around and attach itself to that bodywork as it works its way toward the rear of the car. Very cool indeed. Speaking of turning vanes, we've got turning vanes every which way on this McLaren. We can see them very clearly over in this area. We have an upper element of the turning vane, not attached to a horizontal element, so this is just a standalone vertical winglet, not attached to any horizontal winglet that runs across the top of the side pod and near the radiator inlet, as we've seen on the Ferrari and the Mercedes. This one just a standalone vertical strake. We can see that there is a very small horizontal stay attached to the side of the side pod right there inside that white circle. So very interesting philosophy again on the turning vanes. It seems to be one of the more open areas of development so far this year. In addition to the turning vane, you can see that we have this small protrusion from the bottom of the floor. I would say that this is actually a part of the floor rather than being a part of the barge board. However, McLaren will probably argue that it's a part of the barge board, and rightly so. Let's get around the regulations as much as we can, because that is the name of the game after all. But just an interesting little feature. It's evocative of similar ones that we have seen on cars in previous years, namely from 2005 to 2008. I remember the McLaren MP423 from 2008 in particular had these very interesting protrusions coming out from the front of the floor that sort of ran out in a curving direction, initially straight out, but then they curved back in on themselves roughly toward this direction in an S shape before coming back out straight ahead. So interesting little development perhaps of that idea. Also, what we can divine from this shot, we have interesting shapes on the mirror fairings in this area, and we're going to circle these in black because we're against a white backdrop, but an interesting profile on those mirror fairings there. They are somewhat evocative actually of the McLaren logo, so I do wonder if that's a little bit of marketing in conjunction with aerodynamics. Again, the mirrors if the teams didn't have to run mirrors, they wouldn't, because they just get in the way of the airstream and they produce a little bit of drag. But the regulations say you have to have mirrors, and common sense also says you have to have mirrors, so they're on the car, and there they are. The other detail that we can divine from this shot, and there are a couple more actually, of course, as you've probably been able to see by now, McLaren are running a shark fin. Very, very nice, as you can see there, just running straight across the back of the topside bodywork and the engine cover heading toward the rear wing. Additionally, we can see the DRS actuator mounted on the center line of the rear wing. You can also see in that main plane of the rear wing, there is a depression right where the DRS actuator lines up with the wing itself. We've seen this on several other cars. It seems to be the status quo as far as DRS rear wings. Another detail that we can divine here, we have very intricate development work going on the rear wing end plates. We have those gills cut in the top that we've been seeing on every car thus far. However, we are also seeing these very intricate designs in the midsection of the end plate, where it just starts to turn in on itself at about 45 degrees inboard before going back to vertical. These are very interesting looking gills, and I assume it's just to help some of the air that's coming off of the rear tire, namely in this direction here, as we can see. This would be a very turbulent flow that's coming off of the rear tire, so those gills are probably just there to help condition that flow and streamline that turbulence to accelerate it out the back of the car and perhaps gain just a touch more downforce. The last feature that we can divine from this shot is the profile of the packaging along the side of the car, along the side of the floor. The side of the floor here, just going to draw a straight line so it's a little bit easier to see, and then you can see how the air hopefully will attach itself around the bodywork as it works its way rearward. McLaren have a lot of space here to play with. If I draw a line perpendicularly from the edge of the floor toward the bodywork, you can see how much space they have in this cross-sectional area. We'll just draw a little bit of a hypotenuse in this area just so you can see really the amount of space that they have to play with. So much room that they have in this section to play, just like Ferrari and just like Mercedes. Very good packaging at very least on that new Honda engine, which McLaren are saying is about 90% new. However, a little bit worryingly for all of us, they're comparing the power output figures on that Honda engine to the 2016 Mercedes. Now, we know that Mercedes had a really good engine last year, but Formula One, the development in this sport is so ridiculous that if you are not right at the top of the field from the word go, you're just going to be doomed to languishing amid the back markers. And McLaren, if they are comparing their car to last year's championship winner, sorry, you're late to the party. Aerodynamically, this car is looking great, and there are some more details here that we want to talk about, even just on this shot alone. We've got an S-duct going on, but to finish that last point, don't compare yourself to last year's championship winner. Compare yourself to this year's championship winner if you want to have any shot at dominating this sport and challenging for wins like we all know McLaren wants to do. I don't understand. McLaren Chief Executive Officer recently came out and said that he didn't expect to win races this year. I don't know about you, but if you're the leader of any sort of organization, you do not go out in public and express your doubt as to your organization's competence. You say, yes, we want to fight at the front, and we're doing everything we can to fight at the front. You don't go out and say, yeah, we don't actually expect to be successful. What are you doing? Seriously, what are you doing, McLaren? You've got a car here that looks very decent aerodynamically. Maybe you could have some issues in the engine department, as you have had since 2015 when you signed this supposedly great deal with Honda. But you don't go out and then say it's comparable to last year's championship winner. It doesn't work. McLaren have been in this sport for a very long time. They know better. Just go out and get the job done. You can save all the talk for later. Just see what the car does. Don't spoil people's expectations before you've even turned a wheel on track and say, oh yeah, we're not going to win, or yeah, the engine's sort of like last year's Mercedes. Just don't do that. Anyway, rant completed. We have our S-duct. We can see it here on the top of the chassis. Pretty much identical to the one Mercedes and Ferrari are running on their launch spec cars. Of course, we can't see the entirety of this mechanism because the intake point on the bottom of the chassis is of course obscured from view, but we would expect it to be located someplace on the bottom side of the nose section, probably around here where I've drawn this line. So in this window between this line and this line that's just come in is where we'd expect to see the intake for that S-duct, again just to exert a little bit more downforce across the front of the car without adding too much drag. And on this next shot, we can see a straight-on full frontal view of the car. We can very clearly see the detail on that front wing. Again, all of those flaps going on here. So many flaps. It's just so elegant, it's so precise, it's so well engineered in terms of the craftsmanship and quality of the work that McLaren have done here. Look at these end points here, where the flaps just begin to get started. They look to be razor sharp. And this is the sort of engineering that we usually see on fighter aircraft, where they have these little canard winglets that need to be covered up with those removed before flight tabs just to keep the ground crews from hurting themselves on them, that they're so sharp. Looks like McLaren have a similar design philosophy going on here on the front wing. Absolutely loving it. Also, we can see on the car the geometries underneath the wing. We have these strakes cut into the bottom side profile of the wing. We've seen these on cars in various guises basically since the early 90s, when they ran these vortex generators in these large inverted U-channels inboard of the front wheels. But this design's still very much alive today, albeit in a slightly different configuration in these strakes on the bottom of the wing. Speaking of inverted U-channels, we can see them here on the McLaren on the extreme outboard faces of the front wing end fences. We can see them here on both sides. McLaren only running one per side instead of the two per side that we've seen from Mercedes and from Ferrari. Slightly different philosophy going on here, and we'll see if it pays dividends for them. It seems like there are two prevailing interpretations of the best way to build a front wing end plate this year. We can also see on this shot, albeit somewhat obscured due to the angle that we're looking at, we can see these strakes running across the extreme outboard side of the front wing end fence. They are angled upward just to send some air flying around the front tires. Again, you want to keep the airflow away from the front tire simply because they're these big chunks out in the airstream producing a whole lot of drag. So you want to keep the air away as much as possible. We can also see here on the front wing the adjuster mechanisms for adjusting the flap angle here and here. Very nice touch. Perhaps it's a touch inelegant to have them just sitting there like that, but I don't see any other place to put them, especially given the absolute size 0 dimensions of this wing and all of the individual elements in it. So that's where they are. I don't think they look bad, and obviously you want them to be easily accessible for the mechanics to make any wing adjustments in the pit stop, because they've only got about 3 seconds to do so. So be it as it may, there they are, front and center for us on the front wing. You can also see a little bit better view of the geometries of the nose section. You can also see the profile of those nostrils, I guess we can call them, on either side of the nose tip. You can see how they are just not quite perfectly rectangular. They have a slight rhombus shape to them, and I'm certainly liking that. Definitely, it shows the attention to detail that McLaren have paid in the aero philosophy of their car. Again, I'm just going to say this outright, that Honda engine once again is going to be the linchpin in all of this. If the engine comes good, I think this car has great potential to come good, but Honda so far have not given us too much confidence. Looking toward the midsection of the car, we can get a little bit better sense of the overall plan. We can see these extreme lower elements of the floor and the barge boards in this area here. Very nice touch, again very similar to barge board designs of yesteryear, and I'm very excited to see these design elements coming back into Formula One. We've opened up the regulations again. This is what it should be and what always should be. In addition, we can see the front brake ducts on either side. You can see that there are two main channels to these brake ducts. We have this outboard channel here, which is smaller and seems to be the predominant feeder for cooling, and then we have this inboard channel here on either side, and this probably plays a dual function role. Yes, some supplemental cooling, but also I'm going to say that that inner channel, that inboard channel, is a little bit more geared for aero benefit rather than brake cooling, because we've not seen a Formula One car in recent years that has had the need to have these absolutely enormous front brake ducts, so I think the cooling is taken care of by the smaller ones, and then there's some sort of other aero benefit being played out with those larger intakes on the more outboard face of the brake duct. We can also see the barge board geometries again, how they just very gracefully and very nicely curve away from the chassis center line and then toward the side pod so that that airflow can attach in that direction and head toward the diffuser. Very, very cool. We can also see here a square-on front shot of the S-duct outlet up top. Again, the rationale of that S-duct is going to be to have air funnel into the car from a straight and level attitude, from directly straight ahead, and then you want the air to funnel out of the top section of the car, and you want to accelerate that air so that it comes out at a slightly higher velocity than it came in, so you generate more downforce in the process without adding too much drag. Very nice detail, and I like the overall vent integration here, the naked duct cut into the top of that bodywork. It just looks very nice, especially with this papaya orange that many people speculated McLaren would return to this year, and they've delivered on that rampant speculation. Orange and black, I do like the livery. Personally, I really would have liked to have seen the red and white livery. However, McLaren have no ties anymore to tobacco, and therefore would not quite be appropriate given the McLaren heritage and the needs of the modern-day sponsorship deals. And now on this shot, we have changed our angle slightly upward, but we're still at roughly the same distance to the car as before. Here we can start to get a little bit better sense of the car's overall proportions in the midsection, particularly in the cockpit surround. Of course, the cockpit surround basically homologated in the regulations. There are needs for driver protection, of course, in this area, so you basically want to be drawing a box around the driver roughly to these proportions to protect his head in any sort of accident situation. And of course, all of this homologated in the regulations for that reason. However, looking toward the front sill of the cockpit in this area here, we notice the absence of a windscreen, and Mercedes are running a very interesting windscreen, of course presenting itself at 90 degrees vertical to the incoming airstream, but it has these very jagged serrations in its profile. Air apparently likes to flow around jagged edges when a surface presents to it vertically at 90 degrees relative to the direction of flow. McLaren have opted not to run for any sort of windscreen, at least here in launch spec. Also on this shot, you can get a better overview of the front suspension profile. Obviously, we have double wishbone, so here are the wishbones, and then, of course, the push rod element producing that 45-degree angle there into the pickup points on the chassis. Additionally, there's another little detail that I'd like to point out right here in this area below the main air intake. You can see these two smaller areas cut into the bottom section of the snorkel. I don't think this is an actual air intake. Rather, I think this is a lift point. In the event the car needs to be recovered from out on track, you'd see the crane come in and they would loop a lifting bar through that section there just so that there is a strong point from which to lift the car on a crane and get it on the back of a flatbed and get it back to the pit lane. Interesting detail there. McLaren have used a lifting arrangement like that for a very long time. I remember seeing it on McLaren cars going back at least until 2007, very famously when Lewis Hamilton was carted out of the gravel trap at the first corner at the Nürburgring in the 2007 race, when the heavens just opened on the entire field and everybody skated off at the first corner. We saw Hamilton being craned back on track, and he was lifted by a little loop in that section. So I'm pretty sure that's what that is on the McLaren. Additionally, on this shot, we can get a little bit better angle on those rear wing end plates once again, and you can just see the profile being followed here. They start off vertical, and then they turn in at roughly 45 degrees before going back to vertical, as we have been seeing on all of the other cars thus far. Interesting shots, and it's interesting to see basically the universality of those rear wing end plates. With the exception of those little gills that we talked about before on the midsection of those end plates, everybody seems to be following a very similar design. So interesting to see that overall design trend essentially being copied by everybody inadvertently. It seems to be the best solution for 2017. And on our last shot here, we see the car in full profile, and we can get our first really good look at the geometries on that shark fin. We can see it, of course, running across the top side of the engine cover toward the rear wing down here. So, interesting use of the shark fin. It actually looks quite similar to the Force India shark fin. The Ferrari one is much more intricate. Mercedes, not using a shark fin, but they are experimenting with that T-wing, as Ferrari have already integrated into their 2017 car, the SF70H. However, McLaren, so far, as far as we know, not experimenting with the T-wing. They have just gone for a straight-up shark fin. Very nice. Details that are absent on the McLaren relative to the other cars. If we look along the edge of the reference plane here, and particularly toward the rear tires, one thing that we do not see, which is somewhat worrying, in this section here, Ferrari, Renault, Mercedes, they're all running these turning vanes just forward of the rear tire. McLaren are not. And the only other team so far definitively that I can say not running any sort of turning vanes there, Force India. No development whatsoever along the reference plane, this area here. And that is very worrying indeed. We know that this is an absolutely huge area of development, particularly in this section as the bodywork cuts off and the floor starts to expand in an outboard direction. All of this area is free to play in terms of trying to condition that airflow toward the rear end and feed the upper element of the diffuser. McLaren are not playing in that direction so far. Again, this is a launch spec car. However, we shall see. I'm not too enthusiastic about what McLaren are doing, particularly in the floor area of this car. However, with the development that we are seeing on the barge boards, there is certainly potential that McLaren are going to play in this area, and they just don't want to show us yet because it's launch day, and let's not divulge too many secrets. The other very obvious point that I do want to make about this car, quite simply, look at the sponsorship, or the lack thereof. I am counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 individual sponsors on this car, and that's about it. The rest of the bodywork is that papaya orange and black with some white accents. McLaren have fallen on hard times recently. We all know this, no secret. However, I do not like the fact that we're seeing a team as proud as McLaren with so few sponsors on the car. We've been seeing it for the last couple of years, and each year it just seems to get worse and worse. This is truly a make or break year for McLaren, but the fact that they're already saying that the Honda engine is comparable to a 2016 Mercedes, and their chief executive officer has gone out to say that he doesn't expect them to be challenging for wins, that to me is a massive red flag for this season, and it just really starts to make me question McLaren's future as well as McLaren's commitment for this year, because no leader goes out and says that about his organization, and no team, especially one as proud as McLaren with the history that they have with success in this sport, goes out 3 years running now with a car essentially devoid of sponsorship. That's really bad. And McLaren made a big deal about signing a new deal with Castrol for this year, which everybody was very excited about. This is the Castrol logo. That's it. That's it. From the terminology that McLaren were using with the press releases, we were almost led to believe that it could be a title sponsor deal. But no, just a small decal there on the engine cover. That's not good. That's very, very not good. Honda, they're basically obliged to run the Honda logo simply because, well, it's their engine supplier. But Castrol, they made a big deal about that, and that's the result. That's not very encouraging, guys. So, again, I am very worried about potentially the future of McLaren here, and this car, it looks very good aerodynamically. There's a little bit more development that certainly could happen, particularly in this section. However, the rest of the car looks pretty good, I have to say. It looks comparable to the Renault in terms of its aero development. Again, nobody is quite up to par with Mercedes because that car is just absolutely immense, but McLaren, from an aero standpoint, looks pretty good. They could be a very solid midfield runner and maybe challenge for podiums with Ferrari. But that Honda engine, again, I'm afraid that it's going to be the weakest linked once again this season, and who knows I'm not optimistic. McLaren themselves do not sound optimistic. Fernando Alonso went out and said that McLaren are simply trying to look respectable this year. So you've got your chief executive officer saying that you don't expect to win. You've got your lead driver saying that you just need to earn some respect again. It's really hard times for McLaren, and like I said, the future of the team, I am very much in doubt of it at this point because there are no sponsors on the car, essentially, and they're not expecting to win, and Honda are comparing their engine to last year's Mercedes. Old news, guys. Old news. Sorry, if you want to be competitive, you've got to be cutting edge. McLaren, you know this business. You've been successful in this business before. Come on, give us something to be proud of. This, I'm afraid, is not it. The car looks good from an aero standpoint, but you got to get rid of that Honda engine. I know you signed contracts, but this could very well be the third year in succession where Honda do not deliver. I hope I'm wrong on this, but I'm not optimistic. Honda themselves do not sound optimistic, but we will see. As far as the review of the MCL 32 goes, that is all I've got for us today. I do thank you all very, very much for watching, and I do thank you all very, very much for your continued support and continued engagement. FerrariMan601 saying thank you very much, and we will see you soon.